Silence on the beach. Normandy, France, June 7th, 1944. The morning after D-Day. Silence after the war. June 7th, 1944. Just behind the Normandy coast, the ground was still warm, the sky was gray, and the air was heavy. The smell of death hung in the air like smoke from the previous day. Captain Joseph Ellis brought his right hand to the collar of his jacket and began to think deeply. The crust formed by the drying mud on his collar had hardened like a cut on his neck. With every step, the pain in his ankles reminded him of the same thing. Why us? There were 5 men beside him. Some were very young, but it wasn't the kind of youth that comes with age. The emptiness in their eyes said it all. Others were old, but their bodies looked young, because fear makes people look different. Silence reigned among them, because what they had seen on the beach yesterday had taught them that no words could describe it. As they advanced, they came upon the stone walls of an old village. This village no longer appeared on any maps. It was a small French village that was not even mentioned in Allied reports. Villons-sur-Mer. The captain took the map in his hands to examine it once more. The map was very old, and the ink was so faded that it was almost illegible, but the village was still there. The order given to the team was clear. Investigate all areas where contact cannot be made. The Germans may have withdrawn, but they may have left traps. Be careful. The team slowed down as they approached the village. Everyone felt the same uneasiness, but no one said anything. Their shoulders were so tense that you could hear them breathing heavily. First, the wind changed. The metallic smell enveloping the area was not the smell of dead bodies, but of rusty iron and damp stones. The silence that followed was more than a natural phenomenon. It felt deliberate. It was as if the village had sensed someone's approach. At the end of the road was an arch. The old stone arch served as the village's entrance gate. As the captain passed by, he squinted his eyes. He saw words carved into the stones with nails, faded over time. Ceux qui sont partis reviendront. Those who left will return here. None of them knew French and couldn't understand the inscription. But after passing the arch, they all felt a chill run through them. As they approached the first houses, they noticed that none of the windows were broken and that the houses were in good condition. The windows were intact and the doors were open. No one had forced the doors. The furniture inside was neatly arranged. Pottery, books, handmade blankets. Everything was in its place and intact, but there was no one around. And even more frightening, there was not a single corpse. When Captain Robert reached the old well in the square, he could barely keep his knees from buckling. He didn't feel the weight of his heavy weapon on his back, but rather an indescribable pressure. His mind was buzzing. His heart was beating slowly but strongly. At first he thought it was just fatigue. Then came that first moment he would never forget. Even years later, a window curtain was pulled back from the inside, but there was no one inside. Robert turned to Corporal Hargrove, who had come up beside him. "Do you think anyone still lives here?" The corporal didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the church across the square. "There's something in the church," he said. His voice was low, nervous and strained. "The curtain, it moved." The captain squinted his eyes. Was it a shadow, or was it just his imagination? Whitman, the youngest member of the group, involuntarily turned his rifle toward the window. His breathing quickened. His palms were cold with sweat. "It's like someone whispering, he said. And for the first time, everyone stopped at the same time. Because this time, it wasn't just Whitman. The others had heard the same sound, too. A voice, a low, muffled tone. But it was coming from far away. Yet the tone was strangely familiar. What if they weren't alone after all? What if this village wasn't just abandoned, but a place where trapped souls lingered? The first shadow of whispers. The sound was coming from the church, but its origin was unclear. It carried neither words nor a distinct tone. More like a memory, as if it were the echo of a sound once heard and then forgotten, reverberating through the walls. Robert instinctively gripped the rifle on his shoulder, but the feeling he had wasn't related to his combat training. This was something else, the kind of thing where pulling the trigger wouldn't help. "It's getting dark. We need to set up camp," he said in a short, decisive voice. What he didn't want to say was, "Yes, something is wrong here." But leaving is no longer an option. They didn't set up camp, and instead took shelter in one of the stone houses next to the church. The building was 3 stories high. The furniture was old but sturdy. There was dust, but there was also an unnatural order to the place, as if it had been abandoned. It was as if someone had lived there, keeping it tidy, but then left as if no one was there. Whitman stared at a portrait hanging on the wall for a long time. The portrait was of a man in uniform. He must have been one of the French soldiers, but his eyes, they looked just like Whitman's father in a photograph taken before the war. "He looks like them," he said. His eyes widened as he spoke. Hargrove said, "Who?" in a tone tinged with mockery, because disbelief was the easiest way out. "They, the ones who died on the beach," said Whitman. "Their faces are still in front of my eyes. Their eye sockets were empty, just like this man's." There was no campfire that night. It was quiet outside, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was like a threatening wind, enveloping everything. Sergeant Nolan, the oldest member of the group, sat down at the table and wrote a few lines in his diary. His pen trembled as he wrote. All his sentences were disjointed. Sergeant Nolan summarized his feelings at that moment as follows: "God may have left us here alone. Even the sound of the night felt foreign to me. Even the thoughts running through my mind didn't feel like my own. This village is still alive, but in a different way." At midnight, a sound woke everyone up. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like nails being tapped against a wooden surface. The sound was coming from the church in the distance. Then, another whisper was heard, but this time it was clearer, and this time it contained words. "We are still here." Robert shuddered. His heart was no longer in his chest, but in his throat. He was sure he had heard the voice clearly. The others were awake too. The whole team looked at each other, but no one spoke, because everyone was thinking the same thing. Did I hear that, or did everyone hear that? It was morning, and the church door was open. The door had been closed yesterday, but this morning it was open. No one in the team had touched it. Robert approached the door and stared into the darkness behind it for a long time. The darkness was not just caused by the lack of light. It felt as if something was living there. There was a chair at the entrance of the church. On top of the chair was a rusty helmet, and inside the helmet was a dog tag belonging to an American soldier. There was a name written on it: Private Daniel J. Reeves, 2nd Infantry. Robert turned his head. Reeves had gone missing during the Utah beach landing a few months earlier. His body had never been found, and there had been no further news. Robert knew Reeves. He only remembered him from a brief conversation, but his eyes were unforgettable. This can't be, Robert said to himself. But there it was, in a French village abandoned long before the war began. The identity of an American soldier lay at the entrance to a church. Whitman suddenly collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Someone touched me, he shouted. There was no one behind him, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, the cold touching his skin. It seemed impossible for his body to feel this wrong. Nolan cleared his throat. He wanted to speak, but swallowed hard. His eyes suddenly seemed aged and sunken. This place is where they couldn't move on, he said. Robert turned to him. Who are they? Nolan's voice was tired when he answered. Soldiers abandoned even by death. Whitman trembled as he crouched on the ground, while the others looked around helplessly. Hargrove turned on his flashlight and slowly headed toward the church. Even the flashlight couldn't illuminate the darkness inside the church. His steps were steady, but his breathing betrayed his nervousness. Shaky and short. Something inside him kept whispering for him to turn back. But as the light of the flashlight revealed the closed pews, the dim walls, and the high ceiling, he felt something else. Someone was watching them, but not by one person. Dozens, maybe hundreds of beings were watching them. Silently, invisibly, as if witnessing their every step. In front of the altar, he saw a figure kneeling on the floor. He was wearing an American uniform, but the figure wasn't moving, as if it were a statue. Hargrove was torn between approaching and retreating. At that moment, the flashlight flickered and went out. When it lit up again, the figure had vanished. But there was a wet trail on the ground. Was it blood, sweat, or mud? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. He quickly moved away from there. When he returned home, Whitman was still talking. But now he wasn't talking to his teammates. He was talking to the void. It was as if he was having a conversation with someone. As if someone was answering him. But we couldn't hear them. No, he said. I didn't die in Normandy. I'm alive. No, I don't want to see my father, not yet. His eyes rolled back. His lips cracked. Nolan grabbed him, shaking him to wake him up. But Whitman seemed to have slipped into another dimension, as if he were trapped between the past and the present, as if the village wasn't just abandoned, but pushed outside of time. The next morning, they decided to check the exit route from the village. Robert, Nolan, and Hargrove studied the map. The path leading south was overgrown with brush, making it difficult to navigate, but it was clearly marked on the map. After 2 hours of walking, the result was terrifying. They had returned to the same spot where they had started. Yes, the same house, the same sign, the same ruined well. But they had walked in a straight line, without veering off in any direction. Time, space, direction. Everything had collapsed at once. We can't get out, said Robert. The sentence was simple, but its weight was heavy. It wasn't just Whitman anymore. We were all starting to crack. As night fell, the whispers began again. But this time it wasn't just one or two people. The whole team heard the voices. Come here. Don't leave them here alone. We were just like you. You are just like us now. Nolan threw himself onto his small desk. With trembling hands, he wrote in his notebook, "If we stay here, they'll soon forget us too. Our souls will be trapped here forever. In a village where the war never ends. On a front forgotten by history. will be forgotten forever. Then he placed the pen on the desk. He stood up slowly and set off toward the church. No one stopped him, because everyone now knew there was no way out of this village. That night, another sound was heard, but this time it was clear and distinct. It was like an order, a call, a death sentence. Who will be next? We now know that this quiet French village on the Normandy coast is not abandoned. This place, a place where spirits cannot pass. Not like a passage, but more like a trap. Robert and his team are now fighting, not just to survive, but to not be forgotten. Whitman woke up crying in the morning, but he didn't remember his tears. There was a mark on the wooden floor next to his bed. It was as if someone had been sitting next to him all night. The dust hadn't settled on the wood. Someone had simply sat there. Robert approached the window. It was normal for the weather to be cloudy, but this was different. The sky was a colorless gray. The sun was there, but it didn't warm him. There were no birds in the sky. There was no wind. It was as if time had stopped. He looked at his watch. It was 7:46. A few moments later, he looked again. 7:46. Hours passed, and it was still 7:46. Time is stuck here, just like us, Nolan said. There was a look of acceptance on his face that he couldn't hide. Hargrove began walking alone toward the northern part of the village in the first light of dawn. A cemetery came into view, and he started walking toward it. Some of the headstones he found there looked as though they had been freshly dug, but the dates were 1916, and that was impossible. One of them was newer. He read the name, Private James Hargrove, KIA, 1944. It was his own name. His own date of death was written there. But he was still alive, wasn't he? His entire body froze. Suddenly the compass he was holding in his hand went haywire. The needle began spinning around him. Spinning, spinning, spinning endlessly. And then it stopped with a thud. It wasn't pointing north. It was pointing directly at the grave. When he returned home, he didn't mention it to anyone. He quietly went to a corner and sat down. He felt as though he were sitting in a body that wasn't his own, in a place where even his own shadow felt foreign. Robert looked closely at his face. "Did you see something? Did something happen?" he asked. Hargrove shook his head and could only manage a single sentence. "I'm already dead here." In the afternoon, the sound of a radio came from outside. They rushed to the door in astonishment. The radio signals were from American broadcasts from the war days. Allied forces under the command of General Eisenhower. "The French people are gaining their freedom. Utah Beach has been cleared." Whitman jumped to his feet at that moment. This is the broadcast from the day of the landing. We were picking up this frequency. Robert tried to adjust the frequency to the static, but the device wasn't working. There wasn't even a device in the room. The sound was in the air. It was as if something in the sky was broadcasting it. At the same time, a figure appeared outside. It was barely visible from a distance. He was wearing an American helmet and holding a radio. But he wasn't moving, just standing there. This figure had no face. Whitman rushed to the door. "I recognize him," he shouted. This is Reeves, the man whose name was on the label at the church. He was alive. I swear we didn't leave him behind in Utah." But Robert held him back. "He's your memory, Whitman. Only his memory remains here." That night, everyone had a different dream. But there was one common detail in all of their dreams. A French woman, silently watching them. Her eyes were black, and her mouth was tightly closed. She was pointing to an old village house with her hand. By morning, Whitman remembered the house from his dream clearly enough to draw it, and Nolan whispered at that moment, "That house isn't on the village map." When Hargrove returned home early the next morning, his hands were covered in dirt. No one asked him what he was looking for, because everyone was now searching for answers somewhere. Nolan and Robert decided to investigate the abandoned houses at the northwest edge of the village. They took their rifles and extra ammunition with them. Just in case, they put some water, a few cans of food, and a small hand axe in their backpacks. Along the way, they saw footprints, half buried in the mud. There were only 2 sets of footprints. One looked like American boots, the other much older, almost like wooden-soled French peasant shoes. But the tracks were not parallel. They crossed each other. It was as if someone had followed the other and then disappeared. The first house they entered was very old and looked as if it was about to collapse. The door hinges were torn off, and the kitchen table was turned upside down, but there was still ash in the fireplace. The ash was extinguished but seemed to be still warm. Robert bent down carefully under the table. He found a suitcase under the table. Inside were a worn notebook, a dried-up ink bottle, and several documents written in French. Nolan took the notebook and began flipping through the pages. This is like the village registry. Mail deliveries, marriages, births. Last date, June 4th, 1944, the day before he was taken away. Robert slowly began to read the notebook. Today, the Americans came to the village. Tanks were deployed in the village square. Father Paul is helping those who have taken refuge in the church. But in the middle of the night, a group of soldiers entered the village again without firing a shot. They weren't wearing German insignia or uniforms. They had no eyes. They didn't look human. The page was torn here and ended here. Nolan looked up. This is impossible. There was no fighting here. This village isn't mentioned on the maps. Maybe they directed us here by mistake, but... Robert shook his head. Number, this village has been turned into an operation point. But then, it was covered up. They found similar traces in other houses. The dining tables were scattered as if people had left in a hurry. Baby diapers, half-finished laundry lines, stale but unspoiled bread. When they noticed the writing carved into the wall of one house, they both stopped suddenly. Ce n'est pas un village, c'est une tombe. This is not a village, this is a grave. That night, Whitman didn't say a word, but he had an old military dog tag in his hand. He placed it on the ground. Hargrove picked it up to examine it. Reeves, J.M., U.S. Army born, 1921. Died, unwritten, Reeves. The same name was written there. They decided to return to the church. Robert was certain that something was waiting for him there. Fear was now giving way to another feeling. He had to uncover the truth. This time they opened the door together. The interior was silent, but despite the dim light, some details were visible. An American flag on the wall, a radio lying on the floor in front of the altar, and in the back room, a message written in blood. No one escaped from here. Those outside couldn't get in. They forgot us. Robert picked up the radio, but the battery was dead. But a few seconds later, another sound came, static, then a muffled but clear voice on a frequency. "Bravo, team. Please report your location." Whitman stumbled backward. That voice. Yes, that's our company commander. The radio shouldn't have been working, but it was, and someone was trying to reach them. It was now certain that this village had not been abandoned randomly. Documents, clues, radio recordings, and writings all pointed to the same truth. Someone had stopped something here. But the traces had not yet been erased, and now Robert and his team were right in the middle of those traces. Whitman tried to turn on the radio again. "Bravo team, report your location. I repeat, Bravo team, respond." The signal faded. Only silence remained. But this time, even the silence seemed to echo everywhere. Robert opened the large cabinet at the back of the church. The inside was damp, the wooden shelves rotten, and the books moldy. However, a folder caught Robert's attention. It was wrapped in yellow paper. On top was a French inscription: "Disappearance Report, June 1944. Missing Person Report, June 1944. They spread the documents on the ground. Most of the names on the list were foreign, but one line, seeing those words, left them speechless. Reeves, James M., missing on June 7th, 1944. Witness, Lieutenant R. Whitman. Whitman's eyes widened. The name written there was his own. But how could this be? This document, it was from 80 years ago. He was listed as a witness to the event. He had been erased from history as an unaccounted witness to an unexplained day. Hargrove wanted to go down to the church basement. Robert and Nolan hesitated to go down, but there was no other way out. The stairs were in terrible condition, rotting and with swollen wooden steps. As they took their first step, a musty smell of mud suddenly filled the air, and then they heard footsteps. All three froze after hearing the sound. The sound wasn't coming from the lower floor, but from the upper floor they had just come from. Whitman whispered, "There's someone else here." On alert, they quietly made their way upstairs, but there was no one around. Only the church door was open. They had left it locked. Someone or something must have opened it from the outside. Nolan went outside and looked around, but the village was still there, unchanged. It was very quiet and empty. Everything seemed strangely still. Nothing had moved, but everything looked different. On the way back, Whitman found a bullet casing lying on the ground. There were no marks on it, and it was still warm as if it had just been fired. But when Hargrove picked up the bullet casing, he noticed something. This bullet didn't belong to the American Army. The casing was from a 1939 German-made bullet, but American markings had been carved into the bullet. Robert said quietly, "This village was caught between two wars. Maybe not between two armies, but between two orders." The next morning, they decided to head toward the northern slopes. If the radio signal was coming from somewhere, they could pick it up from a higher vantage point. The hike took exactly 3 hours, but at the end of the trail, they found an observation point on the slope. There was a radio station. The station was covered with a tarp and appeared abandoned, but the tracks around it looked fresh. The footprints resembled old American military boots, and in the mud next to the station, there was a freshly discarded cigarette butt. Whitman looked at the cigarette, the brand, Lucky Strike. These were cigarettes distributed to American soldiers during the war, but the production date was still legible, year 2023. Nolan froze. Someone was here recently. Robert looked around. If so, we're not the only ones who found this village. Maybe someone else was drawn here like us. Whitman shook his head. No, this place doesn't draw anyone. This place holds. On the way back, they noticed a path. The path wasn't on the map, but it was a passageway made of stones hidden among the bushes. They followed the tracks, and there, among the trees, was a small, gray cabin. The front door was open, and the inside was tidy, and on the table was a diary. The only word written on it was, "Survivant, the survivors." This diary belonged to a French doctor. It described how the village had not been abandoned during the war, but had been covered up. On the morning of June 7th, American soldiers withdrew silently. But the soldiers who arrived that night were different from the others. These soldiers did not obey orders. Whatever they had experienced, they had brought here. Not just physical death, but death carried out by orders. Those who remained here vanished silently. No one heard their voices. The last page of the notebook read, "If you are reading these lines, perhaps there is still a way out, but hurry, because the village will begin to forget you too." Robert placed the diary in his bag. Whitman, while surveying the area, asked, "Do you really think we can get out of here?" Robert's voice was clear. "If we can't get out, we'll be next." This village, it lives by erasing memories, and we're slowly turning into those memories. Whitman was doing everything he could to get the radio working again. He pressed the buttons, changed the frequency, raised the antenna, but there was no response from the other side. "Bravo team, please report your location. I repeat, Bravo team." Only the hum of electricity, only a signal-less, empty sky, as if the army no longer existed, as if the world had taken a step back. As they turned back into the forest, evening darkness had fallen over the village. Whitman and his team had placed the diary they had taken from the cabin into their bags and quickened their pace. But just as they reached the stones of the square, they saw a man. He was standing at the corner of the street facing the church, his head bowed. His clothes were gray, and he had no helmet on his back. He was not carrying a weapon. He was simply motionless. Whitman took aim and shouted, "Who's there?" But the man did not move. Then he disappeared. It was as if he had been sucked into the fog, as if he had never been there at all. Robert clutched his knees, his breath coming in short gasps. "We really saw him, didn't we?" Whitman shook his head. His eyes seemed even older. The streets were now quieter. Whispers came intermittently, but the village was still listening to them. Hargrove noticed something as he looked at the walls. On the front doors of the houses, there were red chalk symbols. Some were circles, others were crossed out. On one door was written, "Non entrée, il se souvient." No entry, he remembers. One of them smiled. Who remembers? The war? Whitman shook his head. Sometimes places don't forget wars, but people fade away. There was a rattling sound coming from inside another house. It sounded like the creaking of a wooden chair, or like the winding of a clock that couldn't be wound. When they entered, the house was completely empty. But there was a clock on the mantelpiece. The clock was wound backwards, but time had stopped on it. The hands were stuck at 4:17. Robert tapped the glass of the clock lightly. At that moment, a sound came from behind the clock. This is not a whisper. This is not a prayer. This is the sound of footsteps. Whitman raised his gun. No one was approaching from behind. But the moment the clock stopped and the church bells fell silent, were the same. To the west of the square was a wall in a state of ruin. They moved forward to explore the area behind it, which looked like a courtyard lined with stones. Part of the wall had collapsed, so they walked underneath it, bending down. Inside was a memorial wall with names carved into it. All of the inscriptions were names of soldiers. Some were written in French, others in English, and then they saw 3 more names carved into the stones. Lieutenant R. Whitman, Corporal D. Hargrove, Private. R. Nolan took a step back, his face pale and gaunt. This can't be. How is this possible? The names on the stone looked as if they'd been carved recently. The surface was covered in moss, and even the moss looked fresh. It was as if someone was waiting for them here. They were quite shocked by this and decided to turn back. As they were about to leave, they saw a ruined house and decided to go inside. The ceiling was gone, and inside there was only a broken sink and an old mirror. Hargrove approached the mirror, but he couldn't see himself in it. Only a misty, dark and blurry surface. Inside the mirror, there were 3 silhouettes, but these silhouettes had no faces. Then, another image appeared in the mirror. Whitman's eyes widened. All 3 of them saw themselves in the moldy mirror. But what they saw was quite intriguing. In the mirror, they were lying motionless, as if they had been shot in the back and were dead. Robert whispered, "Did we already die in this village? I don't understand what's happening. What's going on?" Whitman was very scared and turned his back to the mirror, not looking back, because the sharp feeling inside him was now clear. Time is not moving forward here. Time is remembering here, and it is holding on so as not to forget. Night had fallen, and it seemed as if the surroundings were silently screaming. For the team that had not slept all night, day began to dawn slowly. Whitman got up early in the morning. The village was shrouded in fog. Even the stone paths were barely visible. He took out the map in his bag. He had marked the direction they had come from last night on the map, but that path was no longer on the map. No matter how carefully they looked, the path they had come from was not drawn on the map, as if it had never existed. It was as if the direction they were heading in didn't exist either, and everything had been swallowed up by the village. Robert couldn't hide his anxiety. Where did the outside world go? Whitman didn't answer, because this time he didn't know either. They continued on their way, taking slow and nervous steps. In front of them was an old stone well in the village square. It was surrounded by iron bars. It seemed to have been closed not to prevent someone from falling in, but to prevent someone from getting out. Nolan peered inside through the bars. He called out into the darkness. "Is anyone there? Is there anyone there?" There was a moment of silence. Then, an echoing voice came from below. "There is no return. You're too late. You'll all stay here." The voice sounded so much like Nolan's own that it was as if he were speaking, but the voice was more tired, older, and hoarse. Whitman quickly pulled Nolan back up from the well. Suddenly, steam began to rise from the well, and that steam smelled like gunpowder, like the smoke from an old trench. They quickly moved away from the well and continued on their way. No matter where they went, the team couldn't seem to get anywhere. As they walked toward the edge of the forest, they saw the ground suddenly collapse. Beneath them was a sunken ground, an old German trench. Half of the metal cover was open. When Whitman opened the cover completely, the inside was still filled with smoke. There were bullet marks on the walls and dried blood mixed with mud on the floor. The strangest thing was a dried notebook in the corner. Inside the notebook was a note written in English. June 6th, 1944. Do not leave the shelter. The doors are now closed forever. Below it was only a signature. R. Whitman trembled. He was certain he had not written this notebook before. He had not written this notebook, but the handwriting was his. A cloud of fog appeared behind the hill on the eastern slope of the village, and within the mist there were strange figures walking, people carrying weapons, dressed in uniforms, arranged in military formation. These people had no faces, and a wind like the sound of bullets passed through them. Nolan raised his gun. What was that? Enemy? Whitman signaled him to stop with his hand. They were not enemies. They were the echoes of ghosts. They were the shapes left behind by a war. The shadows passed through the village and disappeared. But as they passed, each one looked at them. They had no eyes, but they made themselves felt. What they said was, "You belong here now." The sky began to darken slowly. But that night, Whitman was on watch. When he looked up at the sky, he noticed there were no stars, no moon, no sound of the wind, nothing at all in the sky. It was as if the world had closed in on them. He tried the radio one last time. Amidst the static and crackling, a whisper echoed. "Repeat your position. Bravo, team. Repeat your position." But this voice sounded very much like his own. It was as if the echo of an announcement he had made in the past was now returning to him. Robert woke up. "Did you say something?" Whitman just shook his head. He didn't answer. At that moment, there was only one truth in the darkness. There was no way out, because this village forgot its exits and those who wanted to leave. It was morning, and the village was covered in fog again, but the fog never lifted. Hargrove said he could hear voices in the fog, but he couldn't make out the words anymore. It was just like the sound of a crying child. Whitman, Robert, and Hargrove decided to venture outside the square. But no matter which way they turned, the paths were either blocked by rocks, or their own footprints were leading them back through the fog. Finally, they headed toward the church. They headed toward the building they had sworn not to enter. This time, there was still dried blood on the church door, but the wooden double doors of the church were tied shut from the inside with a rope. Robert quickly pulled the rope. Hargrove struck the door, but Whitman remained silent. Finally, Whitman said, "If we can't open it, that means someone is still inside." At that very moment, the sound of a bell echoed from inside. The sound was very close, but it wasn't coming from above, but from below the ground. Hargrove knelt down and listened to the ground. "There's a cellar down there." Together they removed the old bricks from the back wall. Underneath was a small, rusty door, and above it was a sentence carved in French. "Celui qui entend ne sort plus." He who hears cannot leave. When they opened the door, a damp stone staircase led down, and that bell, it was clear now. Click, 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 a metallic sound. But the staircase was built for one person. Robert shivered. "I have a feeling someone is waiting for us, but we're late." Whitman squinted at the stairs. Maybe we came too early, or too late. The interior of the cellar didn't look like it was from the war. It was older than the war. It wasn't a church foundation. It was a burial chamber. There were mosaics on the walls, burnt candles, but one wall looked freshly painted, and in the middle of the wall was a wooden table. On the table was a radio. The radio was on, and there were no whispers coming from it. Only military announcements. "Bravo, team. Repeat your location. Bravo, team. We can't reach you." Hargrove approached the table, but the table wasn't just a table. Underneath it, there were 3 helmets, and inside each one, clots of blood. One of the helmets belonged to Whitman, another was Hargrove's. The last one was Robert's. Their names were carved into the helmets. The radio suddenly fell silent, and a dead silence descended. The room was so quiet that you could hear breathing, but they weren't looking at each other anymore, because there was a 4th breath in the room. But this breath could be felt. The 4th breath. At that moment, Robert reflexively threw the radio to the ground. The radio's glass shattered, and as it shattered, the damp air inside suddenly grew cold. The candles on the walls flickered but did not go out. Instead, their flames stretched out and began to touch the walls. Whitman fixed his eyes on the mosaics on the wall. One of them had gone unnoticed until then. The mosaic looked as if it had just been drawn, and on it, there were 3 soldiers. The same uniform, the same posture, but their faces were missing. Only dark stains remained, and beneath them, a French phrase was inscribed. Ils ont vu. They witnessed. When they tried to leave the cellar, the stairs were gone. It was as if those stone steps had never existed. The door wasn't closed either, because the door was now a wall. Robert hit it with his hands, but it wasn't even stone. It felt more like cold metal. Whitman sat down silently on the floor. There was no acceptance on his face, only helplessness. His thoughts had turned to inaction. "Why are we here?" asked Hargrove. No one answered, because no one knew the answer. But the silence inside seemed to speak for them. Because you saw. And no one leaves by telling what they saw. After a while, other sounds rose from inside, as if there was another hidden compartment beneath the cellar. Not an echo. The sound of movement, crawling, footsteps, pebbles shifting. But there was something else. Whispers. But this time, the whispers were different from what they had heard before. These were their own voices, orders from the past, radio transmissions, screams. Whitman closed his eyes, and in that moment, he remembered that day during the first military operation. There was a sergeant on the beach asking for help. He had been wounded in the explosion, and Whitman had left him behind without helping him. "There was no time," he murmured, but I looked into his eyes. A voice came from the walls of the cellar, and he looked into yours. "Now you will stay here together." The candles went out, and the room was engulfed in darkness. But the darkness made everything clearer. The silence of the cellar had transformed into something else. It was a waiting. When Whitman grew accustomed to the darkness after the candles went out, he noticed that some of the stones on the opposite wall had shifted from their places. Hargrove and Robert also fell silent. Speaking was now meaningless, because it wasn't an answer that was expected, but a judgment. The stones parted. Behind them, a void made of earth appeared. But it wasn't a void. It was a deep, dugout pit, and from within it, a uniform burst forth. There were bloodstains on it. Its arms were missing. There were tears on its back. There was no need to look to see whose it was, because the owner of this uniform had never left this place. It had been left there on the shores of Normandy. The echoing sounds in the cellar fell silent one by one. Whispers, orders, footsteps. After everything fell silent, only heartbeats remained. Whitman collapsed to the ground. The faces of the men he had once commanded and fought alongside flashed before his eyes, one by one. but their faces were like a mosaic, because Whitman had never really seen any of them. Suddenly, new cracks appeared on the cellar floor. The stones cracked, the earth opened up, and hands emerged. But these hands were not lifeless, nor were they warm. Each one touched a shoulder. Whitman touched Hargrove and Robert, and in that moment, something happened. The voices returned, but this time, the voices were not coming from the radio, but from within them, more clearly, like a memory. These voices sounded as if they were happening now, and they were all delivering the same message. You belong here now. We did not call you, but remember this. Those who come here cannot return. The floor suddenly shook. The cellar began to collapse. But they weren't falling down, they were rising. It was as if the ground beneath them was pushing them upward instead of swallowing them. Someone had made a decision. A whisper was heard very close by. The last witnesses have arrived. The stones are complete. When Whitman opened his eyes, he was back in the church square. But the village was unrecognizable. The buildings were burned. The bell tower had collapsed. And in the middle of the square stood a monument. 3 names were carved into the stone: John Whitman, Thomas Hargrove, Robert Keller. The date beneath the stone: June 7th, 1944. Below it was another sentence: they saw, they returned, but they did not speak. Whitman knelt down. He understood everything now. The village wasn't calling someone every year. It was only bringing back those who had remained silent. The war wanted to complete its silent face, carved into the forgotten gravestones. And now, the names were complete. The bells were no longer ringing. The cellar had swallowed all sound, but one person was still standing: Whitman. He knelt down and looked at the monument. He touched the stone as if caressing his own name with his fingertips, as if the cold surface of the stone was absorbing all the warmth within him. Robert and Hargrove. They stood motionless a short distance away, but it was a state of wakefulness buried in silence, not like the dead. When Whitman raised his head, the sky was bright and clear, but the stars were not visible. The gray, foul cloud of fog that had followed the war was still there, waiting. It was as if time had never moved forward in this village, or as if the same day was repeating itself. June 7th, 1944. At that moment he realized the village had not punished them for their sins, but for their silence. Everyone had done something in the war, but the real curse belonged to those who had remained silent. The radio, whose batteries had run out and whose glass was cracked, rang once more. It crackled suddenly. The voice coming from inside was Whitman's, but it was a younger version, not yet tainted. There are no enemies in this village, but I don't want to stay here. No tears fell from his eyes, because now he too was part of the wall, one of the faceless men in the mosaic. The silence beneath the stone. He began to walk toward the edge of the village, but there was no road. There was only earth, and beneath the earth lay names. With every step, another whisper rose. I was there too. I saw it too, but I didn't tell anyone. Whitman stopped. When he turned around, the village had vanished, as if it had never existed. All that remained was the monumental stone, and beneath it, there was another line. If one day your path leads you to Normandy, if you find a silent village, do not enter. And what about you? Did you realize that war isn't just fought with weapons, but also with silence? Have you ever thought about those left behind? What if one day, somewhere, a whisper reaches you. Will you speak, or will you become one of the stones? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments for more stories.